The image of a bargeman using a long pole used to be a common sight on the canals of Europe. He would walk to the front of the barge, plant his pole in a muck on the bottom of a canal, then push against the pole by walking to the barge's stern. When he reached the back of the barge, he'd dislodge the pole, walk back to the boat's bow, and repeat the process of propelling the barge forward by walking backward. I first came across this image in a novel by the German writer Siegfried Lenz, who wrote about characters coming to terms with German history. But I've since noticed it in the works of other writers, all of them European for some reason, maybe more barges there, I don't know, whose work delves into the materials of time, memory, and freedom. For all these writers, the way forward requires a journey backward. This strikes me as a perfect image for the accomplishment of Kathleen Norris's Acedia and Me, the book under discussion this evening. Kathleen moves backward in her own life and backward to the wisdom of the Christian past in the work of such thinkers as Evagrius Ponticus, to move her readers into a fresh understanding of a very real but unexamined condition of the contemporary world. Kathleen Norris is currently the Killian MacDonald Writer-in-Residence at the Collegeville Institute, a place to which she has returned for her third extended stay. She is the author of such acclaimed work, present on that table over there, as Dakota, Cloister Walk, and Amazing Grace. She is also a member of the Board of Trustees of St. John's University. Joining Kathleen this evening to expand on the themes raised by her remarks and her book on Acedia is Sister Josue Bainan, a member of the Sisters of the Order of St. Joseph, Order of St. Benedict in St. Joseph. Sister Bainan served as liturgy director and formation director in the Chinese Benedictine community of women in Taiwan for 17 years in the last century. Currently, she works in the Spirituality Center at St. Benedict's Monastery, focusing in the area of spiritual direction and supervision of spiritual directors. Also joining us is Brother Paul Vincent Niebauer, who has taught and directed theater at St. John's Preparatory School for 13 years and is presently the vocation director for the Abbey. Brother Paul Vincent has also directed for the St. Cloud Civic Theater and the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University Opera Workshop. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Norris and our distinguished panelists.
Thank you for coming out tonight. Our plan is for each one of us to speak for maybe 10 or 12 minutes or so, relatively briefly, because we really do want to generate discussion. That's my hope anyway. And I'm going to focus tonight on how I came to write about this obscure subject. And second, a brief overview of why Western culture dropped the word acedia from its common vocabulary. And three, how my discoveries about the word's curious history led me to look at acedia's social and political dimensions in the present day. Is acedia, as Aldous Huxley once wrote, the demon of our age? I first encountered the word acedia in a monastery library in a book called The Practicos by the 4th century monk Evagrius. I was skimming through it when I came across something that changed my life. I now believe it is still the best description of acedia ever written. Evagrius describes acedia as a bad thought or a demon, The desert monks sort of use the word bad thought, demon, and passion interchangeably. They never use the word sin, which is one of the reasons I like them. A bad thought or demon that besieges a person, and here I'm going to quote because it is a profound description of acedia. It makes it seem that the sun barely moves, if at all, and that the day is 50 hours long. It constrains the monk to look constantly out the windows, to walk outside the cell, to gaze carefully at the sun, to determine how far it stands from the 9th hour or lunchtime, to look this way and that, to see if perhaps one of the brethren appears from his cell. Then the demon instills into the heart of the monk a hatred for the place, a hatred for his very life, a hatred for manual labor. It leads him to reflect that charity has departed from among the brethren. There is no one to give encouragement. Should there be someone at this period who happens to offend him in some way, this too the demon uses to contribute to his hatred. It drives him along to desire other sites where he could make a real success of himself. It goes on to suggest, after all, it is not the place that is the basis of pleasing the Lord, for God is to be adored everywhere. The demon joins to these reflections the memory of dear ones and of a former way of life. It depicts life stretching out for a long period of time and brings before the mind's eye the toil of the ascetic struggle, and as the saying has it, leaves no leaf unturned to induce the monk to forsake his cell and drop out of the fight. Well, when I first read this, I felt that this guy was describing half my life. I was stunned. And the most uncanny thing for me was that he was defining something I had experienced at the age of 15, but I'd never known exactly what it was, where to place it. And then I was in my mid-30s, and I finally had a word for it. And for a writer, there really is no walking away from such an encounter. So for the next 20 years, I compiled material knowing that I had to write a book about acedia. Well, getting back to Evagrius, I want to call attention to the way he nails that slippery protean nature of acedia, the way it progresses in us, starting with maybe even minor boredom and restlessness, but it quickly leads us into anger and even hatred of those around us. Then we begin to feel nostalgic for people we used to know, and soon we're immersed in sadness and even hopelessness. I think the worst for me is the way that acedia can come as both boredom and restlessness all at once. It can lead to either lethargy or hyperactivity and workaholism, anything to distract me from having to commit to being where I am in the present moment. Well, to my mind, acedia is an ancient word for a thoroughly modern condition. Restless boredom, being unable to commit to lasting relationships or even staying in one place, callous and willful indifference, keeping ourselves so frantically busy that we no longer have the energy to care. These are all major problems today. In some ways, acedia defines us and our culture, but we've lost the word. And as any reader of a fairy tale can tell you, if we're suffering from a condition but don't know its name, we are in deep trouble. So what happened to this word, acedia? Well, this is a basic and I hope not too simplistic explanation, and it's when the 8 bad thoughts of Evagrius and the 4th century monastic tradition evolved in the 6th century into the church's doctrine of 7 deadly sins, acedia was the odd one out. It was thought that only monastic people would suffer from it because of the strict repetitive routine of their lives. And when I first heard that, I was in this room, I was at a monastic institute, this whole idea that acedia would only afflict monks, and I just said to the person next to me, I said, anyone who's been married for more than a year knows what acedia is. I mean, I was stunned. The early monks had viewed anger, pride, and acedia as the worst of the bad thoughts or passions. But in the 6th century, acedia was subsumed into the sin of sloth, which came to mean a relatively insignificant physical laziness, or as Evelyn Waugh once described it, the most amiable of weaknesses. That earlier subtle understanding of the spiritual devastation caused by acedia was largely lost, as was the word itself. But the word acedia has persisted, and I was intrigued to find that it was marked as obsolete in the 1933 edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. But after World War II, it was back in as part of our living language. I mean, that was another little clue to me that I was on to something, that this was an important thing that needed to be examined. Because language and words have a life of their own. And if acedia is a kind of spiritual morphine helping us deny the reality of pain, I guess it's no surprise that we needed it again after the worldwide devastation of World War II, especially the violence that had gone on among so-called civilized nations. Well, as I persisted in my study, I kept finding evidence of acedia all around me. I saw a segue on CNN with the headline on screen going from gas prices rise to child sex offender search. The words were identical in size, as if both stories were of equal importance and equal concern. So which one do I care about? Which one do I care about more? I began to see 24-hour news as a perfect vehicle for acedia, bombarding us so that we lose our ability to care, or even to determine what is worth caring about. And I also started finding many quotes that convinced me that I was on the right track in viewing acedia as a contemporary problem. This is from an essay by the poet Czesław Miłosz. No one can call this failing simply laziness any longer. Whatever it may once have been, now it has returned to its original meaning, terror in the face of emptiness, apathy, depression. It's not isolated hermits, however, who are experiencing its sting, but the masses in their millions. And this from the monk Michael Casey. The ascetiac is a person without commitment who lives in a world characterized by mobility, passive entertainment, self-indulgence. Or this that really got my attention from a Swedish philosopher, Lars Svensson. In a world of emptiness, extremism will stand out as an attractive alternative to boredom. And of course, boredom is one of the symptoms and one of the synonyms for acedia. And this one, a little quote that I thought really bites from the sociologist Orrin Clapp, who wrote a book called Overload and Boredom. It is not at all clear that these three features of modern society, fun, industries, fashions, and celebrity cult, banish boredom. Analogy with aspirin is appropriate. High dosage means not the absence, but the presence of pain. And I found so many quotes I didn't have room for in my text, so if you know the book, I basically made a commonplace book of quotes from all sorts of sources, starting with the Bible and ending with the 21st century college student. Well, in a minor way, I see the confirmation of the relevance of acedia today in that this book attracted much more pre-publication publicity than anything else I had written. And it was a total surprise to me and my publisher. My photo appeared under a photograph of the actress Keira Knightley on the front page of a USA Today Life section. And this I'm really happy about, on the front page of the Los Angeles Times Sunday Lifestyle section under a photo of Dolly Parton. And for the first time, CNN.com asked for a commentary on acedia. They wanted to put something up there about the book. The other thing that happened when I was touring to promote the book, the audiences were much larger than anything I'm used to, over 200 people in Iowa City, and close to 100 in many more. Acedia in Me is the only one of my books that was actually featured for months in airport bookstores. Go Evagrius! I just love that notion that he's out there. And maybe the George Clooney character from the film Up in the Air picked it up and found himself in its pages. If you don't know that movie, Up in the Air, it's worth a look because just about all the characters in it are exhibiting some form of acedia. And there's one scene, a groom who's getting cold feet before his wedding, and he describes an assault of acedia. I had some thoughts, he says. He describes this assault of acedia that would have been recognized as such by a vagrius, and it's a comic scene. It's just brilliant. Well, in conclusion, I want to say that acedia is not merely an individual psychological or spiritual problem. It affects communities and societies, and I'm hoping that my Benedictine respondents will speak to that, because it was this communal aspect of acedia that those audiences wanted to discuss. They raised questions about addictions to the internet and virtual reality, about fractured families who are so hyper-scheduled that they no longer spend time together, about the dissonance of living in a society that is the wealthiest in history, but whose citizens remain dissatisfied, gobbling up drugs for anxiety and depression. In hard economic times, we can lose faith in ourselves and others, and acedia offers a false sense of security. We can care about celebrities or online friends more than our neighbors. We can treat homelessness as just the way things are, which relieves us from having to do anything about it. We can keep ourselves so busy that we don't have time to care. I think if the Christian church has made too much of the vice of pride, which seduces us into thinking too highly of ourselves, it has not made nearly enough of acedia, which allows us to settle for being less than we can be, both as individuals and as a society. There is no cure for acedia any more than there is for anger and pride. It's part of the human condition. But we can learn to recognize it and resist it when it strikes. A method that was recommended to Evagrius in the 4th century and is also a technique that bears a striking resemblance to a so-called new technique in cognitive behavioral therapy is to think about your thoughts. When anger comes or acedia, you examine it dispassionately and try to figure out where it wants to lead you. There is no blame attached, no guilt attached to having such a bad thought because they come to everyone. Pride, anger, acedia, greed, all of it. But we do have some choice in how we respond to these thoughts. And on that faint note of hope, I will turn this over to my respondents.
I was ready to get some water.
Thank you.
Well, because she is probably too humble to hold up the book. Here it is. I read it, and the first 50 pages actually reminded me of monastic studies with Columbus Stewart, Kathleen. Pretty heavy stuff, but the relating so heavily to your personal life is really incredible. I really want to thank you for writing that book. For me personally, and I've read it once, I have a feeling I'll be reading it a couple more times. So I primarily am going to speak from my own experience. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'm 59 and have 17 years of monastic life, so I think this is very timely for me to be speaking about acedia. Later this afternoon, I mentioned to a monk in the snack area that I was doing this, and I was thinking, you know, everything that I really wrote down is pretty shallow and not worth saying, and maybe I shouldn't do this. And then I said, well, that's maybe a form of acedia. And he said, no, it might be the voice of wisdom, actually. It's one of the joys of community life there, yeah. I'm going to make 3 kind of grouped observations, most from my personal experience. The first is that I agree with you profoundly that in love, that love is the center of all true happiness, and therefore, for me, the ultimate weapon in fending off acedia. If Jesus Christ is love, then this is what a true Christian naturally seeks. Of course, we get distracted like crazy, but that's really, for me, at the heart of everything, of life. And so when you spoke about your relationship with your husband and the love that was at the center of that, and the strength and the power of that love, that resonated with me very well. And not that it was easy. This was not an easy love all the time, yeah, as it isn't for me either. Even the feeling of being deserted, as Christ himself may have indeed felt on the cross, will eventually come to an end, and we will be with our Creator for all eternity. A footnote to this, though, one of my frustrations as a Christian is that as long as I'm on earth, I will never meet Jesus Christ. I will never get a chance to talk to him, to touch him. I know we see Christ in each other. I've heard that, and I believe that. And there are great moments of that. But I'm maybe the doubting Thomas. Not that I'm doubting, but I just want to touch him. I want to hear his voice, if only for a few seconds. And there is, for me, the waiting that will not come to an end as long as I'm alive. And you know, as Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord, until I'm dead. And so it's almost as though I feel like for Christians, at least, this is built in for us. This is part of being a Christian, is that there will never be a lasting satisfaction until we die, until we're with God. Connected to your quote that you made of Merton saying the sadness, the disgust with life, which comes from a much deeper source, our inability to get along with ourselves, our disunion with God. It seems to me whether you're married, single, living in community, or whatever, we can all feel at times alone and unloved, even unloved by ourselves. I think that loneliness and feeling unloved is excruciatingly painful for any normal human being. My namesake, Father Vincent Novotny, who was a Benedictine monk of St. Procopius Abbey, excuse me, said to me once that he thought that hell was absolute loneliness, that not only were you alone, but no one else, not only were they not there, but they didn't even know that you weren't there. They didn't care. That everlasting loneliness was his idea of hell. And there's the absence of love. Yeah. Leading me to my second point, I remember about 10 years ago, almost to the day, I was having a number of conversations with people that I had lived with for a long time. And actually, it was a time when I had left the Abbey for 3 months, kind of putting my life into order, reeling from one of the major sexual abuse issues that we were encountering, and had a discussion with my mom, a real heart-to-heart discussion with my mom. And I don't remember the exact words, but I remember the feeling exactly. She said words to the effect, you know, Paul, I know many of the things that basically that I'd been up to through my life that I pretty much thought she didn't know about. And she said, and I love you very, very much. In the moment, I was horrified and terrified, and I won't tell you what I thought she was probably talking about, but I was also, at the same time, filled with great love and thankfulness, gratitude to this mother of mine that accepted me, that was unconditional love that she was really stating. And so then, we're back to love, we're told that God is all merciful, all forgiving, and that we should never despair of the mercy of God. We say that every Lent in the monastic community when we do examination of conscience. So, if that is true, my God loves me infinitely more than my mother does. And I know my mother loves me very, very much. And this, tying back to your quote that you cited by John Climacus, writing that acedia is a voice claiming that God has no mercy and no love for us. That's a demon. That's a demon. My third point, Kathleen also spoke about the impulse to rush to complete a project. My brothers could tell me all about that in my life, whether eating a meal or some larger effort. My classic example would be directing, and certainly in the first, at least half of my career at Prep, from the moment of selecting the play, really focusing on at least opening night, and that everything else was breakneck. So that, and there are many things to do, and I could list them, you could imagine, from poster selection to rehearsal schedule to costume selection to, it's just, there are a myriad of things. And then realizing that, you're focusing on the wrong thing, Brother Paul. The thing to be focusing on is the process. It's not whether your child graduates from high school when they're 6 years old. It's what do they need in the moment? What love, what support do they need in the moment? And I provided that, I think, for the students. My regret is that, and I did get better at it, but my regret was that I didn't enjoy the process, appreciate living in the moment with them walking along the way. Maybe because I didn't trust all sorts of things, and so, but that is that problem of living in the moment, living in the future rather. And now that I'm 59, starting to live in the past, remembering certain things as well. So once again, living in the moment kind of gets left behind. I have a little medicine chest, and it coincides, I think, in a couple of ways. Abijah, you're going to get some press here. I do believe in better living through chemistry. As Abijah says, in giving us a step to help us up to a window of positivity sometimes when we are so buried that we just need a boost. And so we need the pharmacist. My dear friend, Father Vincent, mentioned that I mentioned earlier, told me over 40 years ago when I was feeling overwhelmed with acedia-like challenges. I don't know if I was exactly old enough, though I was in high school, and really struggling. And one of the things he said was, well, just get going, get busy. You're really talented, you have a lot of interest, just get busy. And I thought, well, that's really superficial. That's really not very profound. Of course, now, when I'm still not his age at that time, I realize, there's a great deal of wisdom to that. Indeed, get busy. I've learned that regular exercise, hobbies, a short walk in the fresh air, a good night's sleep, healthy eating, a good dose of sunlight, which I enjoyed later on this afternoon, and of course, daily prayer is so important to my healthy well-being. So yes, there are those times when just get up, go for a walk. And speaking of daily prayer, the Psalms, which is what attracted me to this monastery in the first place, the office, the ancient prayers reflecting the human predicament are such a comfort to me, not only because they often fit my situation perfectly, but because they are of my human family. Just as I am not alone in my joy and thanksgiving, so am I not alone in my anger, loneliness, and pain. Thank you.
My response will focus on ways in which I experienced acedia during 50 years of my monastic life. Brother is 59, I'm 74, so I'm a bit older. I first met Evagris's writings in the 1970s while living in a small group of Benedictine sisters in Taiwan. My work included formation of the community, 10 years of caring for 50 babies in an orphanage as a nurse, and learning Chinese. Hungry for anything on monasticism, I literally ate up all I could get my hands on, including Evagris, and specifically the Practicos and chapters on prayer. His description of acedia helped me understand much of what was happening inside of me and the Taiwan community. The demon of acedia, called the noonday devil, intrigued me the most because Evagris says it is the one that causes the most trouble of all. Acedia pressing its attack on the monk the 4th to the 8th hour makes him seem like the sun doesn't move, and we heard the description. The sun barely moves at all. The day is 50 hours long. The monk comes out and looks out the window and wants to see if there's anybody else out there and is bored. A simple example of it for me from growing up on a farm. My one brother at about age 12 was out raking hay and was becoming very bored. And he did what my dad would do in order to determine when it was time for lunch. So he'd look at the sun, and he was sure that he'd been working a long time. So he decided to come home. He got to the kitchen, and sure enough, it was 10 o'clock in the morning. He had still 2 hours left to work. Living on a foothill and mountain of a mountain overlooking the Taiwan Straits, the hot summers helped me understand why Evagris calls it the noonday devil. Where I lived there, overlooking, there was a sea breeze shift at about 12 to 2 o'clock at noon and in the middle of the night. And at that shift, the air was so still and it was so hot and stifling, you couldn't move. And I often thought when Evagris talks about this utter listlessness, that physically that was a wonderful example. A siesta made it possible to regain a bit of energy. I believe the demon of acedia tracks with special force at midlife, when life, and monastic life in particular, loses its luster. Evagris's 4th to 8th hour could be understood as the 4th to 8th decade of one's life. As I reached my 40s, after having worked hard to make a place for myself in Taiwan community, with the people, with the daily routine and work, life was becoming boring. I was experiencing what Evagris described as the demon of acedia that instills the heart of the monk a hatred for the place and its very life, and a hatred for manual work, leads him to reflect on how charity has departed, and no one to give encouragement, and looking elsewhere to find something better. This demon attacks, I would say, where one is most vulnerable. I wanted to be successful, I wanted to be loved and well thought of. I began doubting the value of my work, of my place in the community. The hurts I received from others stung deeper and lingered longer. I became preoccupied with exactly how somebody offended me. I felt dry inside, restless and bored, and especially with the persons with whom I lived. Restless, I sought friends outside. Cashin says that acedia is multifaceted. He says there's a kind of acedia that makes those seething with emotion fall asleep. I knew a sister like that. Whenever we talked about something very important in chapter, she fell asleep. Another kind encourages a person to abandon his cell and flee. This demon can look like laziness, restlessness, and we heard all the things that Kathleen said. I saw all of these manifested in some form or other in myself or in the community with whom I lived. In the mid-1970s, we foreigners were asked to return to the States as a process of handing over leadership into the hands of the Taiwan community. Acedia struck during that time. Though I was tired, restless, and bored, I didn't want to come back to St. Ben's because I was used to monastic life in a smaller community. I considered joining a small community in Manchester, New Hampshire. Over a period of 5 to 10 years, I expended much energy with this demon that, quote, drives one to desire other sites where he can more easily procure life's necessities, more readily find work, and make a real success of himself. It required a very real and conscious decision to find God again at St. Ben's. And it was particularly my vow of stability that helped me. Stability, which means committing oneself to a specific place, way of life, community for a lifetime, and trusting God can be found there. My determination to faithfully live this promise freed me from the chains of acedia during that difficult transitional period of my life, only to attack in another way. About 10 years later, when I was in my 50s, I broke my leg, or I was in an accident. Acedia attacks, I think, viciously at times of sickness and weakness. The days of recuperation seemed endless. I experienced a hatred for the place and the very life, despite wonderful 24-hour nursing care. Acedia suggested charity had departed from the sisters. I found myself analyzing and judging who came to visit, who did not, who talked to me, and who did not. I often felt angry, disgruntled, and sad until the day my 85-year-old mother came to visit. I complained about not being interested in anything, not having an appetite, and shared with her my so-called difficulties. She stopped me short when she said, "They call that depression, and it goes away when you move around." She has an 8th grade education. Unable to move around physically forced me to face myself and my ugly thoughts about everyone and everything until one day I woke up and realized how totally self-centered I had become. That awareness helped me to decide to do things that would bring me out of myself, like write letters to the sisters that were away, and I can't remember what else I did. Now in my mid-70s, how am I tempted by the demon of acedia? Evagrius says this demon depicts life stretching out over a long period of time and brings before my eyes the toils of the ascetic struggle and leaves no leaf unturned to induce the monk to forsake his cell. Now I would say it attacks me primarily through my decreasing energy. I struggle to be faithful to my daily walk or exercise. I'm slower to pursue my interests, healthy hobbies, and leisure activities. Though I still like to grow plants, take pictures, and write poetry, my lower energy means that I let small details slip, and I procrastinate. My work at the Spirituality Center seems less interesting, and my lectio and reflection often seems boring and feels useless. Taking advantage of this decreased energy, acedia sometimes lures me to leave a task to play computer games, which are easily accessible, distracting, and dulls the mind. Sometimes makes me late for community prayer and meals. So in thinking about what it has helped me the most, I have 3 things. The first one is to stay the course. I consciously live my vow of stability, which asks me to stay with what I'm about, not to change my work or prayer too readily, to really stay present to my community members. As Kathleen Norris says, as she quotes Seneca, to seek and find God where I am, because it is your soul you need to change, not the climate. I find it helpful to stay as faithful as possible to the daily monastic schedule of community prayer, Eucharist, personal prayer, meals, and common life. This helps me get past what I feel like doing to do what I promised to do. That is, to seek God and not myself. Amma Syncletica said, "There is a grief that comes from the enemy, full of mockery, which some call acedia. This spirit must be cast out mainly by prayer and psalmody." Entering as fully as possible into my life of prayer helps me to focus on what I'm about. And when I say that, I mean how to stay fervent in my prayer. The second thing that has helped me is to claim my inner work as my primary work. Kathleen Norris, you have said that acedia is a danger to anyone whose work requires great concentration and discipline, yet is considered by many of little practical value. Kathleen says, acedia is the monk's most dangerous temptation, for it makes the vowed life seem futile, if not foolish. Monastic people live with the tension of having to find meaning in a way of life that the world, for all the reverent lip service, considers largely useless. I know my real work as a monastic is inner transformation. That is, staying aware of the inner movements of my heart and thoughts as they arise, noticing which are life-giving and which are not, and then choosing to move toward the good. People, my family included, could understand very well the value of missionary work, but to value the doing of inner work is not at all clear to others. I need to consciously claim my inner work as my primary work, and even when it seems ineffective. Sometimes I wonder if this demon doesn't enter through the back door by urging me to keep busy so I have something that I can call my work. And the third one is, I think, very important as we grow older. And I call it help from the outside. Being introduced to those good Cistercian studies series, as well as a good Jesuit spiritual director during those years in Taiwan, really opened my understanding of the spiritual life, spiritual journey, how that works, what goes on inside of us on our spiritual journey. Upon returning to the States, studying Christian spirituality, reading spiritual classics of well-known Christian mystics as a preparation for my work at the Spirituality Center and my continued work there is invaluably helpful. Thomas Merton describes acedia as a trial which bears a certain analogy with the dark night of the soul of the mystics, and I find that interesting. He thinks that acedia and the dark night maybe has some kind of connection. When our hearts are stripped bare and we're stripped of our pretenses, when we're left without an answer and even our image of God changes, then reading how others deal with these experiences can help us keep hope, and we can be assured that God's power does come through when we are weak. Thank you.
we have a goodly amount of time for questions, comments, disagreements, and those disagreements would be just fine. So are there any questions for any members of the panel that you would have? Any comments about what you've heard? Michael.
I find this talk of demons and devils very exciting to the imagination. It's much more interesting than thinking of evil as the absence of the good. But just as we know or believe that God is spirit and not to be defined by analogy, how can we analogize acedia as an entity, like a demon or a devil, and how can we avoid gendering the demon or the devil? I've only heard the male attribute so far. I don't have an answer to this, I'm intrigued by it, but I'd like to know how we can use this exciting analogical material but avoid gendering.
Well, one thing I'll say, that when have been talking about acedia, I think the most useful, just the monks basically, the monks and the Desert Mothers also, passions, demons, bad thoughts, they kind of use those interchangeably. And the most useful thing for most people was to talk about bad thoughts or good thoughts. Because the monks said there are also good thoughts that come to us, or virtues. That help us defeat the bad thoughts. And most people could sort of grasp onto that notion, oh yeah, I've had a bad thought of anger. If you use the word demon, people think of, Hollywood and The Exorcist and crazy stuff. So it is exciting, but it's not, I'm not sure how useful it is.
A question, I'll take the prerogative since no one's waving their hand. You're next then.
Could you say something more about how acedia can almost call us to that inner transformation, that inner work? There's a job so you refer to that, but I do look at that in many ways. Like an opportunity for inner work?
Well, it seems to me when something's wrong or isn't right, I tend to want to fix it or make it right. To feel in any, I think acedia is kind of like a nasty diamond. It's got all sort of facets, so I don't think there's one way of just defining what it is, thus maybe the word acedia. But so it's not pleasant. So for me it would be, what do I need to do to get out of this? I don't know if you were noticing when she was speaking from her medicine cabinet, I was writing it down. There's always room in my medicine cabinet for stuff like that.
Do you have any thoughts yourself about that issue that you'd like to share with us?
Having these thoughts, pay attention to them, and what am I really thinking
Thanks very much. A question I would like to raise, Kathleen, you talk in your book about the relationship between acedia and depression, and it arose in both of your comments, either directly or indirectly. Kathleen, starting with you, can you, for those who haven't read the book, what do you say about the relationship between acedia and depression? Can you summarize that?
Yeah, I had to
quickly?
address that because, that really, I knew that would be a big issue for a lot of readers. Well, I think you're just talking about depression and why are you using this word for it, or you're making people feel guilty, who are sick, and that sort of attitude that we have about it. And I would say that sadness has always been part of the experience of acedia, and it comes in, but Evagrius's, for his initial description of it, it is accurate, I think. It comes in towards the end. It's sort of almost an end result of this process that begins with restlessness, boredom, moves to anger, then nostalgia, then sadness. It comes in, it's not a primary cause. The boredom and the restlessness are what will strike you, and the uselessness of everything. Why bother? That's what's going to strike you first with acedia. With depression, at least in my experience of depression, if I'm depressed, I kind of know why. It's there up front. I can say, of course I'm depressed. My husband died. Yes, I'm depressed. And there's a reason for it. With acedia, it can just come out of nowhere, and the sadness is not the primary mover, kind of. It comes along almost as a side effect. It comes later in the process. And I think that, the distinctions between depression and acedia are notoriously fluid and have been for, a very long time, and that's probably how we should leave it. It's not easy to define. And of course, one of the problems we have with the word depression is it's a catch-all. It can mean I lost my cat, or I have pancreatic cancer. Or I have a medical condition called depression. It's just all over the map when we use that word. So it's almost a useless word anymore. But except you're in medical terms, clinical depression, which a doctor would define. That's probably the only useful use of that word depression, but we use it for a lot of other things now.
Anyone else have anything to say about that?
It seems acedia is it almost feels a little bit less, it seems more subtle or more like, I don't care. I really don't feel like doing this today. Why bother? That kind of thing. When you were saying what, I think I'm going back to that inner work, because what helps is, I think, is in Lexio or self-reflection, when we look back at what I thought about today or how I've been this last month, and we have like a recollection day or something, and then you think back your last month, and where did you go up, where did you go down, what was that like, that there's inner work that can be done. And if depression is as I understand it, depression kind of grips you as a condition, where acedia is just a kind of a vague, slow, I don't care thing. That's what comes to my mind right now.
Michael, you had your hand up.
My question actually comes from the woman over here mentioning something about...
Speak up, Michael. Speak as loudly as you can.
My question comes from the woman over here talking about distracting through entertainment or whatever. It's a question of, is there a connection between acedia and fasting in some way, either coming out of it or going into it?
I would say fasting from certain thoughts and fasting from certain, going with what you just want to do. And I don't know, at least for a monastic, staying with the program seems to, that means not doing some things and not having some things when you wish you could or want to have. Yeah, as a way through, yeah, as a way through and past, and not let it take over. I don't know if that makes sense.
My own experience with depression and reflecting on how I got out of it makes me wonder if for some of us, certainly for me, acedia led to depression. And one of the things that helped me get out of depression was learning how to attend to my thoughts. Cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I see a real connection between how I allow myself to think and then what happens as a result. And it occurs to me that there's one habit of thinking that really works well to battle acedia, and that's gratitude. Would any of you care to comment on that?
No, I just think that's probably very good advice. And love, you know, the virtue, like Vagrius talks about this, but the virtue on the other side, you know, the flip side of anger is compassion. And basically it's love and kind of staying with the program. I mean, love even when it's difficult, when it's hard, but basically loving, caring, that's the virtue. And I think gratitude has to be a part of that. That's the virtue that's sort of the flip side of acedia.
I have two thoughts and questions that might seem to contradict each other. The first is something that has come to me later on in this conversation with Brother Covington. In your response to Sister Mary, you talked about seeing a problem and wanting to fix it. And I wonder if there's a virtue to acedia in that it raises these issues and these problems to be fixed. And how is that seen as a virtue, or can it be seen as a virtue? And the second piece is, I think it might be casual, but it may have come earlier. The idea that I think gluttony is the root of the others, the seven deadly sins, possibly. Sister Mary, is that right?
It's a good place to start, yeah.
Starts with gluttony and then moves on. And I'm wondering if perhaps a better place to start would be acedia. And if you want to comment on any of that, that'd be great.
See, I'm listening to some of these questions, and I'm thinking that, or observations that we're all individuals, and I think we all experience it similarly but differently as well. When you said fix it, that made me nervous, that because I don't know if it's fixable. Just as I said, you know, with our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. It's always going to be there. To understand it, to and therefore understanding yourself better, but never totally. One of the blessings of living in community is having, for me, brothers that can help me through a ton of stuff. That's one of the reasons I entered community. I'm the youngest of 3 boys, but also having sisters that can help me through as well. So that's a gift we have that I think most of the outside world doesn't realize, because we have such a gift like that. And you certainly seek it, but we kind of have it built in if we wish to use it, and that is another issue. Yeah.
Caring to use it.
I'd like to say something about that gratitude that you talked about. I do believe there's real value in choosing, in watching one's thoughts and feelings, and then choosing the positive. and one can choose gratitude, or one can choose. One of the things that I kept thinking about is someplace in the Bible it says that we should be joyful. And it wasn't like be joyful when you want to or like to, but it's almost a command to be joyful. And I do think, I find that in community, you can be either choose to be joyful or you can choose to be, I don't know, there's something about choosing joyfulness and choosing gratitude that's, I think, very worthwhile.
We have 3 questions. Glenn, and then the woman behind Glenn, and then Wilfred.
Just having had visits from 13 and 9-year-old grandson, I'm really impressed with the amount of screen time. That whenever there's any downtime, in our house we have TV, computer, iPad, and iPhone. And there seems to be a need when there's nothing else definitely going on. In front of a screen to fill up that time. I'm just wondering if we're raising a bunch of kids that are really be prone to TV, that they won't have had experiences with inner work that allows that will help them to get to
Well, I remember talking to one of your grandkids, and the thing that apparently excited him the most here was walking to the Stella Maris Chapel. So, I mean, he wasn't, he was not averse to that. And I know you were looking up birds and things on the iPad, so, pictures of local birds. And I think a lot of it has to do with what you're doing. If you're escaping totally by yourself in some kind of a video game and not connecting, but like, I had to join Facebook to basically find out what my nieces and nephews were up to, and it connects me in a way that is really quite helpful. So I think a lot of it depends on what you're doing with it, because sometimes it will connect and sometimes it will disconnect, and those are the choices. Talking about choices, that is always the choice with acedia, is to connect or disconnect, because acedia will always push you to disconnect from other people and the world. Always, and you have to struggle sometimes to reconnect.
Back there.
I just wanted to thank you for raising this whole topic, because to me the whole conversation about how we experience, darkness, demons, the devil, bad thoughts, all of this is so relevant and prevalent in all of us, and pretty missing from a lot of theological and spiritual conversations. So thank you for keeping it away from sloth and giving it its own time. And as we have been talking about all the fluidity between one thing and another, C.S. Lewis's work came to mind in Truth His Letters, where he does such a beautiful investigation of that voice of darkness. And in particular, when he says, giving advice to the person who's trying to draw away from God, he says, keep them in the past, keep them in the future, anything. And it reminded me so much of what you were talking about tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's important to have heard what Sister said just a moment ago, to realize that, to choose, to make the choice. I know what I should be doing, now do it, or don't do it. That takes time, I think, certainly does with me. And so, being patient with oneself in that situation, I think, is key, to depend on others, to, I think, getting back to the demon, the very first question we had, I used to think little devils were silly, but we had this wonderful piece from the Desert Fathers, radical honesty, where you're in the situation, and I know no one's ever been in this situation in this room, but maybe somebody might be in the situation where they've done something or they know something that is just terribly weighting them down. And they know that if they were to tell their superior or someone that's important to their life, to them in their life, that that person would think much less of them. I know you've never been in that situation. Because in fact there's this little demon sitting on your shoulder saying, don't tell, don't say anything. Because if you do, they'll think so much less of you. And then of course you get the guts, the grace to finally tell your superior, your spiritual director, your friend, your lover. And they don't think less of you. The demon is furious. And the problem, if it's a problem, doesn't necessarily go away, but it's all of a sudden devaluated down to a much more reasonable, manageable level. That devil for me is neither male or female, by the way. But I do believe in those little blankety blanks.
Wilfred.
My sister said something about choosing what you're thinking, and then you have Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Eat, Pray, Love. Her lover tells her, groceries, if you can't control your thoughts, the game is over. And he said, select your thoughts the way you shop for clothes.
Yeah, there's something.
But don't we usually think of acedia as doing away with volition? But I'm hearing you all say, no, it doesn't. That's not really true. You always have the ability to choose. Is that right?
Well, it can be pretty much weakened if you have, and I think this would be true with any of the bad thoughts, with anger, with pride. If you let yourself really get weighed down with it, you're weak, but maybe something will come along that will let you see that, yes, in fact, you do have a choice. I mean, I think choices and thinking about your thoughts and deciding which way to go with them rather than letting them just lead you. My image for it, when I had that experience at 15, I had no idea what was happening. It was a death spiral. One thought after another just bombarding me and thinking, why am I thinking about this? And life stretching out for a long time. I'm 15 years old. Why am I even thinking about all this stuff? But it's kind of a death spiral that an airplane pilot can get into, and after a certain point, there is no point of return. You crash. But if any, now I feel I'm a little bit, if that happens again, I'm a little better equipped to deal with it. And that's where Vagrius comes in. I mean, his advice about it, thinking about your thoughts, is really, really very helpful.
Time for a couple more questions. Here and then there.
Congregations address acedia, and if they don't do it adequately, how can they bring that issue to the congregant and help solve the problem, if it's solved at all?
I think it helps very much to read spiritual classics, and maybe to do that in groups or something like that. But one can learn a lot from those that have gone before.
And yeah, getting familiar with the term and the conditions. Cassian, the desert, Almus Eclecticus comment that you quoted as wonderful. The desert tradition of Vagrius. Any of those things that can help us, understand what it is we're dealing with.
I think you're right in just getting the term out there, just understanding what it is. Half the time that's half the battle, because we think, oh my gosh, no one else is going through this or has gone through this. We've all gone through it, I think, pretty much. And so just naming it, I think, is a big help in the first place, talking about it. And then realizing that, oh my goodness, there are writings on it.
And that's, a place to start. I mean, I'll plug my own book, but the Commonplace book, the quotes at the end, it's a pretty long series of quotes. There might be something in there to get discussion going for a group, say. And you wouldn't have to read the whole book, but say Robertson Davies, or that quote I read by Miloš about, masses in their millions are going through this now. It's not just isolated hermits in the desert in the 4th century. It's here and now, and he's writing 20th century. But so maybe using that as a springboard. Because I think Joshua certainly addressed that, and I write about it too. That the idea of the noon of midlife is where acedia does often strike people who have been living maybe in a religious community or having faith, and it's sort of along with the midlife crisis. I mean, everything can get shaken. So there is that aspect, but it can strike the beginner in a sense too. I mean, my experience at 15, where I had. I was going to church, singing in church choirs, didn't think about God a lot. I thought more about the Beatles probably, but, it can strike early, but I think Joshua's sort of talking about it at different stages of the religious life and your experience was really profound, was really helpful.
I think that, just a minute, I have to, I never had an aversion for God myself, but I've certainly experienced being very bored with prayers, being very bored with the life, being bored with the Eucharist and all that. And what helped me, and what helps me, is to try to pay attention to this liturgical year, because there's a wonderful rhythm in that liturgical year. So there's a time when you can be joyful, and there's a time when you can be really sad, and you can go up and down, and it's built in. At least that's how I see it. And I find that's, and then the other thing that is this whole thing about how does one stay fervent, pray with fervor, and you just kind of have to make yourself do that. I think.
I want to tell. It's just kind of a funny story, but I remember when I was first starting to go out to Assumption Abbey in North Dakota, where I'm an oblate, and I would visit for maybe 2 or 3 days at a time, and it was very novel, and I was just. These images in the Psalms were striking me, and I was really, I would always go and have a wonderful time. Well, then I went to spend a whole week. And about midway through the week, and I thought, well, I want to see what this is like. Midway through the week, I ran into the abbot, and I said, I think I've made some spiritual progress. He said, really? His eyebrows went up a little bit. I said, I am bored out of my mind, and I have to go to church again. And he said, yes, that is progress. And I think, but that was because then, and this sort of talks about Mary Reuter's question, that yes, now I have something to work with. I have something to do here. I'm not going to stop going back to sitting with those grumpy old monks. But now I have something to work on, or to work with and work on myself. And I recognized it as progress. And the abbot did too. And the rest is history, I guess you could say. But and I'd run into that here, when I came to spend 9 months, a good gestation period of 9 months at the Institute. and periods when it was just, oh man, to walk up that hill and go to church again, you know, it just is it's such a struggle, and keep the fervor in there. And I remember one time, this wasn't here, it was another monastery, going to the Easter Vigil, because I knew that was the right place I had to be, but it was like observing the Easter Vigil from Mars. That's as much connection as I felt with anything that was going on, and I'm still glad I was there. And I remember that vigil for lots of reasons. But, you know, being there was the good thing to do, but boy, it felt really, really disorienting, really strange. And I think, you know, you have certainly been, but at least you have something to work on then.
Thank you, panel.